They called him the Animal, and when you heard that name whispered in the back alleys of Boston in the 1960s, you knew someone was about to die. Joseph Barboza wasn't just another mob enforcer. He was the man who would kill for the Mafia, betray them to the FBI, and become the first person to ever enter the witness protection program. But here's the thing nobody tells you about being protected by the government: it doesn't mean you're safe. Welcome to EverKnownOfficial. Joseph Barboza entered this world on September 20, 1932, in the old whaling city of New Bedford, Massachusetts, born to Portuguese immigrants who had traveled from Valpasos in search of the American dream. His father, Joseph Barboza Sr., had tried his hand at professional boxing, stepping into the ring for just 2 fights in Los Angeles before hanging up his gloves. His mother, Pomida Camille, worked as a seamstress, her fingers dancing across fabric to keep food on the table for their growing family. The Barboza household wasn't just Joe and his parents. He had 2 brothers, Donald and Anthony, and a sister named Anne. They lived in New Bedford's tight-knit Portuguese-American community, where the smell of the sea mixed with the aroma of traditional cooking, and where everybody knew everybody else's business. But this working-class neighborhood, filled with the children and grandchildren of immigrants, would soon become too small for young Joe's ambitions. When Joe was just 12 years old, his father abandoned the family. The man who should have taught him how to throw a punch, how to be a man, simply walked away, leaving Pomida to raise 4 children alone. Joe wept all the way home that day, and the abandonment left him with enough explosive rage for a lifetime. His mother struggled, working as a waitress and sometimes resorting to shoplifting just to survive. Young Joe watched her suffer, watched her scrape and struggle, and something inside him hardened like concrete setting in the sun. School didn't hold much appeal for a kid burning with rage and hungry for respect. Though Barboza had less than an 8th-grade education and was barely literate, he was remarkably fluent in Portuguese, Italian, and Spanish. Languages came naturally to him, picked up on the streets and in the neighborhoods where different immigrant communities bumped against each other. But formal education, that was for kids who hadn't learned that the world was a place where fathers disappeared and mothers cried themselves to sleep. He became involved in criminal activity, including robberies and assaults, as a teenager, and was first sent to prison at the age of 18 in 1950 to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution, Concord, for 5 years. Prison was supposed to break him, to teach him a lesson about staying on the right side of the law. Instead, it became his university of crime. In the summer of 1953, Barboza led what would become the largest prison break in the institution's 75-year history. He and 6 other inmates had guzzled contraband whiskey and pilfered amphetamine tablets, overpowered 4 prison guards, and raced away in 2 separate cars. During their brief freedom, they beat random people in the street, cruised the bars in Boston's Scollay Square, wandered to Lynn and Revere, before being apprehended at a subway station in East Boston after barely 24 hours. That November, while awaiting trial for his prison break, Barboza slugged a prison guard in the cafeteria for no reason. 3 months later, he tossed a table at a guard's chest when he entered his cell. The guards learned to approach Joe Barboza carefully, like zookeepers approaching a wild animal. The nickname would come later, but the behavior that earned it was already there. It was during his time at Walpole Prison that Barboza's life took a crucial turn. Barboza may have first been exposed to figures of Boston organized crime while incarcerated at Walpole. The wise guys, the connected guys, the men who commanded respect even behind bars, they noticed the wild Portuguese kid who fought like he had nothing to lose. And Joe noticed them right back, studying their mannerisms, their codes, their power. Boxing became his outlet, his way to channel the rage that threatened to consume him. His boxing record shows Joseph winning 8 out of 11 matches, with 5 ending in knockouts. He was classified as an outfighter known for having very powerful punches. His first professional boxing match was on April 18, 1949, against Rocky Lucero in El Paso, Texas, and his last fight on September 23, 1961, against Don Bale in Boston. He was a real crowd pleaser who could take an opponent out with 1 punch if he could hit him. In one notable fight in a Boston arena, a lanky black middleweight knocked Joe down twice but won by decision. Against very good fighters, Joe had little chance at all. Boxing great Bobby Quinn, who sparred with Barboza in jail, later recalled beating him until his hands hurt, but Barboza wasn't in the ring for glory or championships. He was a sparring partner of Patriarch of Crime family associate Americo Sacramon, future Massachusetts Auditor Joe DiNucci, Edward G. Connors, and Anthony Veranis. these connections mattered more than any title belt. Through boxing, he was making contacts, building relationships with men who moved in the shadows of New England's underworld. Barboza was a stocky, muscular man with a thick neck and an angular, watermelon-shaped skull. He looked like what he was: dangerous. Women found him attractive despite, or perhaps because of, his violent reputation. He married a Jewish woman and fathered a daughter in 1965 and also had a son, living in Chelsea, Massachusetts. But family life couldn't tame what was growing inside him. After his parole in 1958, he became a recognized figure in East Boston's organized crime circles and was a regular at a bar on the corner of Bennington Street and Brook Street, which became known as Barboza's Corner. His crew of small-time burglars and thieves consisted of Joseph W. Amico, Patrick Fabiano, James Kearns, Arthur Bratzos, Thomas DePrisco, father and son team Joseph and Ronald Dermody, Carlton Eaton, Edward Goss, and Nicholas Femia. The thing about Joe Barboza that set him apart from other street thugs was his desperate desire to belong. The New Bedford-born mobster was a proud Portuguese, not Sicilian, but his dream to be part of La Cosa Nostra proved so strong that he thought he could create a loophole. If he killed enough men, if he did enough of the Mafia's dirtiest biddings, then they would have no choice but to make him a made man. Due to his dark complexion and Portuguese heritage, Barboza was referred to as the nigger by his Italian associates. Every slur, every reminder that he wasn't one of them, that he could never truly be one of them, fed the furnace of his rage. They used him for the dirty work, the killings that needed doing, but they'd never open the door all the way. He was never officially inducted into the Patriarca crime family because of his non-Italian ancestry, but within 8 years during the escalation of gangland warfare, he earned a reputation as one of Boston's most prolific contract killers and sidewalk soldiers. The Patriarca crime family, run by Raymond Patriarca out of Providence, Rhode Island, controlled organized crime throughout New England. They ran the gambling, the loan sharking, the extortion rackets. And when they needed someone hurt or killed, increasingly, they called Joe Barboza. His crew was officially supervised for the Patriarca crime family by Stephen, the rifleman Flemmy, who would later become infamous in his own right. The violence escalated, the kills multiplied. According to the FBI, Barboza committed 26 murders, 26 lives ended by his hands, 26 families destroyed. And with each kill, Barboza thought he was getting closer to his dream of being made, of being accepted, of finally belonging. One incident perfectly captured the essence of why they called him the animal. At a nightclub, when an older Italian patron complained about Barboza's crude behavior, Barboza slapped him hard across the face. When Henry Tamlio shouted, "I don't want you to ever slap that man. I don't want you to touch anybody with your hands again," Barboza leaned over and bit the man's ear. "I didn't touch him with my hands," he snarled at Tamlio. Some sources claimed he actually chewed off the man's cheek, though this was never verified. But the message was clear: Joe Barboza followed orders in his own savage way. He took sick joy in his crimes, and it became increasingly difficult for the mob to keep the animal on his leash. The nickname, the Animal, wasn't given in admiration. It was a warning, a description, a statement of fact. Joseph Barboza was such a ruthless mafia hitman that he once chewed a man's cheek off. When you dealt with Joe Barboza, you were dealing with someone who had crossed the line from criminal to monster. The year 1965 marked a turning point in Barboza's bloody career. On March 12 of that year, a small-time criminal named Edward "Teddy" Deegan was murdered in an alley next to an office building in Chelsea, Massachusetts. Deegan was shot and killed in an alley at approximately 9:30 p.m. What seemed like just another mob hit would eventually become one of the most controversial cases in FBI history. The truth about the Deegan murder was far more complex than anyone knew at the time. According to FBI files that would surface decades later, Joseph Barboza, Ronald Cassesso, Jimmy Flemmy, and Wilfred Roy French had carried out the murder. But that's not the story that would be told in court. That's not the story that would send 4 innocent men to death row. The FBI knew what was happening. They knew who the real killers were. FBI memorandums showed that informants had reported to agents that Flemmy and Barboza had contacted Patriarca to get his approval to kill Deegan, and that a dry run had been made. Neither the FBI agents nor anyone else warned Deegan or took steps to prevent their informants, Flemmy and Barboza, from carrying out the plan. By 1966, the walls were starting to close in on Barboza. He was arrested on weapons charges, and suddenly, the man who had killed so many for the Patriarca family found himself abandoned. Patriarca refused to put up his bail and killed anyone else who offered to. Two of his associates, Bratzos and DePrisco, went to raise Barbosa's bail. 5 weeks later, after raising $59,000, the pair were murdered in the nightlight cafe by soldiers serving under Ralphie Chong, Lamatina. After relieving them of their bail money, they stuffed their bodies in the back seat of Bratzos' car and dumped it in South Boston. The message was clear: Joe Barbosa was being cut loose. The family he had killed for, the family he had desperately wanted to join, was throwing him away like garbage. And that's when the FBI made their move. The FBI began diligent efforts to turn Barbosa into an informant. In the summer of 1967, Steve Flemmi met with Joseph and informed him that Gennaro Angulo and his brothers had plans to murder him. The federal agents painted a picture for Barbosa. Cooperate or die in prison, testify against your former associates, or wait for them to find a way to silence you forever. The FBI offered him immunity and a new life in San Francisco if he gave up Patriarca. For a man who had been betrayed, who had been used and discarded, the choice became clear. If the Mafia wouldn't accept him, he would destroy them. Barbosa became a Federal Bureau of Investigation informant in 1967. He was a star witness in the trial of 6 men convicted in the 1965 murder of Edward Deegan. 4 of the accused were sentenced to death, and another 2 were sentenced to life imprisonment. The trial was a sensation. Louis Greco, Henry Tamlio, Ronald Casesso, and Peter Limon were convicted of Deegan's murder and sentenced to death. Joseph Salvati and Roy French were sentenced to life imprisonment as accessories. Barbosa's testimony was devastating, detailed, and completely convincing. There was just one problem: most of it was a lie. Joseph Salvati had borrowed $400 from a local moneylender. When Barbosa unexpectedly took over the moneylender's accounts and demanded immediate payment, Salvati couldn't pay and stole a baseball bat from one of Barbosa's enforcers. A few days later, Salvati was arrested for the murder of Terry Deegan, a man Salvati had never even heard of before. The truth was even more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Federal Bureau of Investigation agents Paul Rico, Dennis Condon, John Morris, and John Connolly had knowingly helped convict innocent men in order to protect Vincent "Jimmy the Bear" Flemmi and Joseph Barbosa. The FBI had made a devil's bargain. They would let innocent men die to protect their informants. Barbosa's cooperation saw Patriarca indicted on murder conspiracy charges in 1970. Patriarca was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and another 6 mobsters were incarcerated for murders after Barbosa testified. The animal had turned on his masters, and he was taking them down one by one. In March 1969, Barbosa was paroled under the name of Joseph Bentley and relocated to Santa Rosa, California, where he enrolled in a culinary arts school. The FBI had created something new for their star witness, the Witness Protection Program. Barbosa became the first person admitted into the Federal Witness Protection Program. The government gave him a new name, a new life, a fresh start. They taught him to cook, thinking perhaps he could channel his violence into something productive. But you can't teach an animal to stop being an animal. In summer 1970, Barbosa murdered Clay Wilson. According to the FBI, this was the 26th murder by Barbosa. In 1971, he pleaded guilty to a second-degree murder charge and was sentenced to 5 years at Folsom Prison. Even in witness protection, even with a new identity and the government's protection, Joseph Barbosa couldn't stop killing. He met a small-time crook named Clayton Ricky Wilson, who confided about money and valuables stolen during burglaries. According to Paulette Ramos, a 19-year-old friend of Wilson, Barbosa got into an argument with Wilson. He shot and killed Wilson, buried him in a shallow grave, covered it with a tree stump, and frightened the 2 women into keeping quiet. While in Folsom Prison, Barbosa did something unexpected. He wrote poetry. At prison, Barbosa wrote poems about the American Mafia, including Boston Gang War, the Mafia Double Crosses, A Cat's Lives, and the Gang War. The man who could barely read or write in his youth was now putting his experiences into verse, trying perhaps to make sense of the chaos he had created and lived through. But the most shocking revelations were yet to come. Years later, investigations would reveal the full extent of the FBI's corruption in the Deegan case. Reporter James Southwood had been brought in to help write a book with Barbosa. During their conversations at Fort Knox, where Barboza was being protected, Barboza told him, James, Louis Greco wasn't in the alley. Barboza had lied. He was admitting Greco wasn't there when Deegan was murdered. Winter Hill hitman John Martorano would later testify that Barboza admitted to framing the men convicted of killing Deegan because the Mafia screwed me, and now I'm going to screw as many of them as possible. It was revenge, pure and simple. The men who had used him and thrown him away would pay, even if innocent men had to suffer for it. The damage was catastrophic. Louis Greco, Henry Tamlio, and Ronald Casesso all died in prison. Joseph Salvati and Peter Limon were released in 1997 and 2001, respectively, after spending 30 years in prison. 4 innocent men had spent decades behind bars. 2 had died there. All because Joseph Barboza wanted revenge and the FBI wanted convictions. In January 2001, a judge overturned Peter Limon and Joe Salvati's convictions after uncovered FBI documents proved their innocence. The truth had finally come out, but it was too late for the men who had died in prison, too late for the families destroyed, too late for justice to mean anything to those who had suffered the most. Meanwhile, Barboza continued his life under government protection, but old habits die hard. He couldn't stay out of trouble, couldn't stop being who he was. The animal was still an animal, even with a new name and a new city. The FBI had created a monster, protected a monster, and now they couldn't control him. In early 1976, Barboza, now living in San Francisco, made a fatal mistake. On February 11, 1976, Barboza went to visit his old friend and mob associate James Chalmers in San Francisco's sleepy Sunset District. He thought he was visiting a friend. He thought he was safe. He thought wrong. Chalmers had earlier tipped off Patriarca family underboss Gennaro, Jerry, Angulo. Angulo sent Caporgi Malario M. A. Zanino and mob soldier Joseph Russo to watch for when Barboza left Chalmers' residence near the corner of 25th Avenue and Moraga Street. The man who had testified against the mob, who had sent their boss to prison, who had betrayed everything they stood for, was finally in their sights. The Mafia has a long memory, and they never forgive. Never. As Barboza walked to his car that February day, he might have sensed something was wrong. Maybe he saw the shooters approaching. Maybe he reached for a weapon of his own. Or maybe, after years of looking over his shoulder, he was simply tired. He was shot dead in San Francisco in 1976 after his whereabouts became known to Patriarca underboss Gennaro Angulo. The first person ever placed in the witness protection program was dead, gunned down on a quiet street in San Francisco. The government's protection had failed. Or perhaps, more accurately, some sins can never be hidden from, some betrayals can never be forgiven, and some animals can never change their nature. The legacy of Joseph the Animal Barboza is one of violence, betrayal, and corruption that reached the highest levels of law enforcement. A congressional committee later reported that the FBI's conduct must be considered one of the greatest failures in the history of federal law enforcement. The agency that was supposed to uphold justice had instead perverted it, sending innocent men to death row to protect their killers. Think about that for a moment. 4 innocent men were sentenced to death, 2 others to life in prison. The real killers walked free because they were useful to the FBI. The very people tasked with protecting society had become accomplices to murder, to perjury, to the destruction of innocent lives. All because they wanted to bring down the Mafia, and they didn't care who they had to sacrifice to do it. The bullets that killed Joseph Barboza on that February morning in 1976 didn't just end a life, they punctuated one of the darkest chapters in American law enforcement history. But the story didn't die with him. In many ways, it was just beginning to unravel, like a sweater with a loose thread that, when pulled, reveals the entire garment was rotten from the start. J.R. Russo, the man who pulled the trigger that day, would later be convicted of Barboza's murder. During his trial, details emerged that painted a picture of calculated revenge, years in the making. The mob had waited, patient as spiders, for their moment. They knew the FBI couldn't protect Barboza forever. They knew that eventually, the animal would make a mistake, would trust the wrong person, would let his guard down just long enough. James Chalmers, the man Barboza had trusted, the friend he went to visit that fatal day, had sold him out for nothing more than the mob's approval. Chalmers wasn't paid for his betrayal. He did it because that's what you did in that world. You proved your loyalty by delivering your friends to their executioners. After Barboza's death, Chalmers disappeared into obscurity, living with the knowledge that he had set up a man who trusted him enough to walk into his home unarmed. The reverberations of Barbosa's life and death continued long after his body was cold. In 1997, 21 years after his murder, Joseph Salvati walked out of prison a free man. He had spent 30 years behind bars for a murder he didn't commit, convicted on the testimony of a lying killer and the complicity of corrupt FBI agents. Salvati was 64 years old when he was finally released. He had gone to prison a young man with small children. He emerged an old man with grandchildren he had never held. Marie Salvati, Joseph's wife, had waited for him all those years. She worked multiple jobs to support their 4 children, visiting her husband in prison every week for 3 decades. She never remarried, never gave up hope, never stopped believing that someday the truth would come out. When reporters asked her how she had endured it, she simply said she knew her husband was innocent, and you don't abandon innocent people. The Salvati children grew up without their father. Anthony, the eldest, was 14 when his father was taken away. He became the man of the house overnight, working after school to help his mother pay the bills. Sharon was 12, Peter was 9, and little Maria was only 7. They endured the taunts of classmates whose parents whispered about the murderer's children. They changed schools multiple times, trying to escape the shadow of their father's false conviction. Peter Limon's story was equally tragic. Convicted at 33 years old, he spent 33 years in prison before being exonerated in 2001. His wife, Olympia, raised their 4 children alone, working as a seamstress to keep food on the table. She would bring the children to visit their father, trying to maintain some semblance of family through thick glass and monitored phone calls. Limon's son, Peter Jr., later said that visiting his father in prison was like looking at a caged animal, not because his father was dangerous, but because the system had trapped an innocent man and displayed him like a zoo exhibit. Louis Greco and Henry Tamlio weren't as fortunate. They died in prison, Greco in 1995 and Tamlio in 1985, both maintaining their innocence to their last breath. Greco had been a small-time criminal, yes, but not a murderer. He spent the last years of his life in a prison hospital, dying of stomach cancer while shackled to a bed. His final words to a prison chaplain were reportedly, "Tell them I didn't do it. Tell them I was innocent." Henry Tamlio left behind a wife and 4 children. His son, Henry Jr., spent years trying to clear his father's name, hiring lawyers with money he didn't have, writing letters to politicians who didn't care. When Tamlio died in prison, the guards found dozens of letters he had written to his grandchildren but never sent, telling them about the life he wished he could have shared with them, about the fishing trips they would never take, about the birthdays he would never attend. Ronald Casesso, another of the men falsely convicted, died in prison in 1991. Unlike some of the others, Casesso actually was involved in criminal activities, but not this particular murder. The FBI knew he was innocent of killing Dagan, but they let him rot in prison anyway because he was convenient, because his conviction made their case stronger, because one more mobster off the streets was worth any price, even if that price was justice itself. The real story of what happened began to emerge through the tireless work of attorneys and investigators who refused to let the case die. Victor Garro, an attorney who represented Salvati, spent years fighting to uncover the truth. He filed motion after motion, appeal after appeal, each one rejected until finally, decades later, secret FBI files were discovered that proved what Salvati had been saying all along: he was innocent. These weren't ambiguous documents. They were clear, dated FBI memos that showed agents knew who the real killers were before the trial even began. One memo, dated 2 days before Deegan's murder, actually listed the real killers and noted that an informant had told them the hit was about to happen. The FBI did nothing to stop it. Another memo, written after the trial, explicitly stated that Salvati was not involved in the murder. H. Paul Rico, one of the FBI agents involved in the cover-up, was eventually called to testify before Congress about his role in the scandal. When asked if he had any remorse for what happened to the innocent men, Rico's response chilled the room. "What do you want? Tears?" He showed no remorse, no regret, nothing but cold indifference to the lives he had destroyed. Rico died in 2004 while facing murder charges in Oklahoma for a different case, having never spent a day in prison for his crimes. Dennis Condon, Rico's partner, maintained until his death that he had done nothing wrong. He claimed they were fighting a war against organized crime and that sometimes innocent people get caught in the crossfire. But this wasn't crossfire, this was deliberate targeting. This was knowingly sending innocent men to death row to protect the real killers because those killers were useful to the FBI. The corruption went even deeper than just RICO and Condon. The House Committee on Government Reform later found that the wrongful convictions were known to many in the FBI and the Department of Justice. Multiple supervisors had signed off on reports that contained the truth about the Degan murder. They all knew, they all stayed silent. They all let innocent men rot in prison to protect their informants and their cases. In 2007, a federal judge awarded $101.7 million to the 4 falsely convicted men, or in the cases of Greco and Tamlio, to their families. It was the largest wrongful conviction settlement in U.S. history at the time. Peter Limon received $26 million. Joseph Salvati received $29 million. The estates of Henry Tamlio and Louis Greco each received $13 million. The wives of the deceased men, Olympia Limon and Marie Salvati, each received $1 million for loss of consortium. But what's $29 million for 30 years of your life? What's $13 million to children who grew up without their fathers? How do you put a price on watching your children grow up through prison glass? How do you value the birthdays missed, the graduations unattended, the grandchildren never held as babies? During the civil trial, Marie Salvati testified about the day her husband was arrested. She described how FBI agents had come to their home, how they had dragged Joseph away while their children screamed and cried. She told about how her youngest daughter, Maria, had hidden under the bed and refused to come out for hours, convinced that if she stayed hidden, her daddy would come back. The government's lawyers argued that the agents were just doing their jobs, that they couldn't have known the full extent of what was happening. But Judge Nancy Gertner rejected these arguments completely. In her ruling, she wrote that the FBI's conduct was malicious and utterly intolerable in a civilized society. She noted that the agents hadn't just made mistakes, they had deliberately framed innocent men and then covered it up for decades. The role of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI in this scandal cannot be understated. This was the era when Hoover was at the height of his power, when the FBI operated with virtually no oversight, when the ends always justified the means. The Degan case was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of behavior that prioritized convictions over justice, statistics over truth. Hoover had long denied that organized crime even existed in America, claiming it was a myth. When he was finally forced to acknowledge its existence, he went to the opposite extreme, authorizing any and all methods to combat it. The Top Hoodlum program, launched in 1957, gave FBI agents broad latitude to develop informants within organized crime. But somewhere along the way, the line between controlling informants and being controlled by them became blurred. Vincent "Jimmy the Bear" Flemmi, who was one of the actual killers of Degan and whom the FBI protected, would go on to commit numerous other murders while working as an FBI informant. His brother Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi would later become a notorious FBI informant himself, along with Whitey Bulger, leading to another massive scandal in Boston. The corruption that protected Barboza and Jimmy Flemmi would metastasize, spreading through the Boston FBI office like a cancer. The damage extended far beyond just the men who were falsely convicted. Edward "Teddy" Degan, the actual murder victim, became almost forgotten in all of this. He was a small-time criminal, yes, but he was also a human being. He had a family. He had people who cared about him. His murder was never truly solved in the sense that justice was never really served. The real killers either died or were protected, and innocent men paid the price instead. Degan's family had to live with the knowledge that not only was their loved one murdered, but his death was used as a tool for even greater injustice. They attended the trial, heard Barboza's lies, watched as men they had never seen before were convicted of killing their relative. Years later, when the truth came out, they had to grapple with the fact that the real killers had walked free while they had been told justice was served. The psychological impact on all the families involved was devastating. The Limon children spoke about growing up in poverty because their father, the breadwinner, was in prison. They described being ashamed to tell people their last name, of using their mother's maiden name at school to avoid the stigma. Peter Limon Jr. became a lawyer, driven by his father's case to fight injustice, but he could never get back the childhood stolen from him. Joseph Salvati's son, Anthony, developed a distrust of authority that never left him. How could it? The very people who were supposed to protect society had destroyed his family. He watched his mother age before her time, working herself to exhaustion to keep them afloat. He watched his siblings struggle with the trauma of having their father ripped away. And all the while, the FBI agents responsible went home to their own families every night, collected their paychecks, received their commendations. The case also raised profound questions about the death penalty. 4 of these men had been sentenced to death. If Massachusetts had not abolished capital punishment in 1975, if the appeals process had moved more quickly, innocent men would have been executed. The state would have killed them based on perjured testimony that the FBI knew was false. How many other cases like this existed? How many innocent people had already been executed based on lies and corruption? In 2003, Congress held hearings on the FBI's use of informants, sparked in large part by the Barboza case and its aftermath. Witness after witness testified about the culture of corruption that had infected the Boston FBI office. They described agents who were more interested in statistics than justice, who saw informants as assets to be protected rather than criminals to be controlled. Former FBI agent Robert Fitzpatrick testified that when he tried to investigate the corruption, he was shut down by his supervisors and eventually forced out of the bureau. He described a culture where questioning the use of informants was seen as disloyalty, where agents who raised concerns were marginalized and their careers destroyed. The Barboza case also illuminated the dangerous psychology of informants like him. Here was a man who desperately wanted to belong to the Mafia, who killed for them hoping to earn their acceptance. When they rejected him, his desire for belonging transformed into a desire for revenge. The FBI gave him the power to destroy those who had spurned him, and he used it without conscience or remorse. Dr. Robert Hare, a psychologist who studied criminal psychology, later analyzed Barboza's behavior and concluded that he exhibited classic signs of antisocial personality disorder. He had no empathy, no remorse, no ability to form genuine emotional connections. To him, people were either useful or they were obstacles. The FBI had essentially weaponized a psychopath, pointed him at their enemies, and then acted surprised when innocent people got hurt. But perhaps the most tragic figure in this entire saga was not one of the falsely convicted men, but Barboza himself. Not because he deserved sympathy, he was a killer who destroyed countless lives, but because his story represents the complete failure of every system that might have saved him. His father abandoned him, the education system failed him, prison turned him into a worse criminal, the Mafia used him and discarded him, and the FBI corrupted whatever small chance at redemption he might have had. In those poems he wrote in Folsom Prison, there are glimpses of self-awareness, moments where Barboza seemed to understand what he had become. In one poem he wrote about being a cat with 9 lives, but I've used them all. In another, he described himself as a monster of their making, but a monster nonetheless. These weren't the words of someone without any capacity for reflection. They were the words of someone who knew he was damned and had decided to drag as many others down with him as possible. The witness protection program was fundamentally redesigned after Barboza's death. New protocols were put in place, stricter supervision, better psychological screening. But the program's first participant had exposed its fundamental flaw. You can give someone a new name and a new city, but you can't give them a new soul. Joseph Barboza was always going to be Joseph Barboza, whether his driver's license said Joseph Bentley or not. The FBI also implemented new guidelines for handling informants, though critics argued these reforms were too little too late. The damage was done, the trust was broken. In Boston particularly, the relationship between law enforcement and the community was poisoned for generations. How do you trust the police when you know they're capable of framing innocent people? How do you cooperate with investigations when you know that cooperation might make you a target? In 2011, the Massachusetts legislature passed a law providing compensation to individuals wrongfully convicted of crimes. It was called an Act to Compensate Wrongfully Convicted Persons, but everyone knew it was really the Salvati Limon Law. It provided $500,000 for each year of wrongful incarceration, though no amount of money could truly compensate for what was stolen. Victor Garrow, the attorney who had fought for decades to free Salvati, reflected years later on what the case meant. He said it showed that our justice system is only as good as the people operating it. When those people are corrupt, when they prioritize convictions over truth, when they view citizens as expendable in their war on crime, then justice becomes a mockery of itself. The families of the wrongfully convicted men formed an unlikely bond through their shared trauma. They would gather sometimes, these people brought together by injustice, and share their stories. Marie Salvati and Olympia Limon became close friends, understanding each other in a way that no one else could. They had both waited decades for their husbands to come home. They had both raised children alone while insisting on their husband's innocence to a world that didn't want to hear it. The children of these men grew up and had children of their own, but the trauma passed down through generations. The grandchildren of Joseph Salvati and Peter Limon grew up knowing that their grandfathers had been stolen from them by the very government that was supposed to protect them. They learned early that authority could not be trusted blindly, that justice was not guaranteed, that sometimes the good guys and the bad guys wore the same badges. In his final years of freedom, Peter Limon spent time with his grandchildren, trying to make up for all the years lost. He would take them fishing, something he had dreamed about in prison, teaching them patience and persistence, qualities that had kept him sane during 33 years of wrongful imprisonment. He never spoke bitterly about his experience in front of them, not wanting to poison them with his anger, but the sadness never left his eyes. Joseph Salvati wrote a book about his experience, titled The Innocent Man. The shocking true story of how I survived 30 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. In it, he described not just the injustice done to him, but the daily reality of prison life for an innocent man. Every day he knew he didn't belong there. Every night he went to sleep hoping he would wake up from the nightmare. 30 years of days and nights, over 10,000 of them, knowing you're innocent while the world believes you're guilty. The book tour were painful for Salvati. People would ask him if he was angry, if he wanted revenge. He would explain that anger was a luxury he couldn't afford in prison. Anger would have consumed him, driven him mad. Instead, he focused on survival, on maintaining his sanity, on believing that someday, somehow, the truth would come out. But now that he was free, now that he was vindicated, the anger he had suppressed for 3 decades sometimes overwhelmed him. As we reach the end of this story, it's important to understand that there are no heroes here. There are only victims and victimizers, the innocent and the corrupt, the dead and the damaged. Joseph the Animal Barboza was both victim and victimizer, a man shaped by violence who shaped others through violence. The FBI agents who protected him were supposed to be heroes, but they became something far worse than the criminals they pursued. The real Joseph Barboza died long before those bullets found him in San Francisco. He died when his father walked away. He died when the Mafia used him and refused him. He died when he decided that if he couldn't belong, he would destroy. He died when he sat in a federal courthouse and swore to tell the truth, then proceeded to lie and send innocent men to their deaths. But here's the thing about truth, it has a way of surfacing, even decades later, even when powerful people try to bury it. The truth about Joseph Barboza, about the FBI's corruption, about the innocent men who suffered, eventually came out. It took 30 years, but it came out, and when it did, it revealed something fundamental about justice. It's not a guarantee, it's not automatic, it's not inherent in our systems or institutions. Justice is something that has to be fought for, protected, demanded. The families of Salvati, Limon, Greco, and Tamlio fought for justice and eventually won, though the victory was bitter and incomplete. The FBI agents who orchestrated this injustice mostly died unpunished. Joseph Barboza died believing he had gotten his revenge. The Mafia bosses who ordered the killings and the revenge mostly died in prison or in their beds. There's no clean ending here, no moment where justice triumphs completely. What we're left with is a cautionary tale about what happens when the line between cops and criminals becomes so blurred that they become indistinguishable. When law enforcement adopts the tactics of those they pursue, when they decide that ends justify any means, when they view citizens as acceptable casualties in their wars, they become something worse than criminals, they become tyrants. The story of Joseph the Animal Barboza is ultimately a very human story about the desperate need to belong, the corrosive nature of revenge, and the terrible price of corruption. It's about how a young boy abandoned by his father became a monster, how that monster was used by other monsters, and how innocent people paid the price for all their monstrosity. Today, if you visit the graves of Louis Greco and Henry Tamlio, you'll find simple headstones that give no hint of the injustice these men suffered. Their families have added inscriptions. Falsely accused, finally vindicated on Greco's stone, truth and justice prevailed on Tamlio's. But did they really? Can justice that comes decades too late after death really be called justice? Joseph Salvati, now in his late 80s, still lives in the Boston area. Sometimes he drives past the courthouse where he was convicted, where Barboza pointed at him and lied. He doesn't stop, doesn't linger, but he remembers. He remembers the moment the verdict was read, the sound his wife made, not quite a scream, not quite a sob, but something primal and broken. He remembers his children crying as he was led away in chains. He remembers, and he knows that no amount of money, no vindication, no apology can give him back those 30 years. Peter Limon passed away in 2017, 16 years after his exoneration. At his funeral, hundreds came to pay their respects, family, friends, and strangers who had followed his case. His son Peter Jr. gave the eulogy, talking about his father's strength, his refusal to become bitter, his determination to make the most of his freedom. But he also talked about the empty chair at every family gathering for 33 years, the absence that shaped their lives as much as any presence could have. The reverberations continue. In law schools across the country, the Barboza case is taught as an example of prosecutorial and law enforcement misconduct. Young lawyers study the documents, the testimonies, the failures, hopefully learning what not to do. But lessons written in books are different from lessons written in blood and tears and wasted years. The name, the animal, has become synonymous with the worst kind of criminal, not just someone who breaks the law, but someone who corrupts the very systems meant to enforce it. Joseph Barboza earned that name through violence, maintained it through betrayal, and sealed it through perjury. But the real animals might have been the men in suits and badges who used him, who knew he was lying and let him do it anyway, who sacrificed innocent men on the altar of their ambition. There's a moment in the congressional testimony about this case that stands out. Joseph Salvati was asked what he wanted people to understand about his experience. He paused for a long moment, this man who had lost 3 decades of his life, and then said simply, "It could happen to anyone. If it happened to me, it could happen to you, to your children, to anyone. That's what I want people to understand. Our freedom is only as strong as our vigilance in protecting it." Those words echo now years later, a warning and a reminder. The animal is dead, shot down on a San Francisco street in 1976. The corrupt FBI agents are dead. Many of the mobsters are dead. Louis Greco and Henry Tamlio died in prison, innocent men paying for crimes they didn't commit. But the danger that created them all, the willingness to sacrifice truth for convenience, justice for statistics, innocence for convictions, that danger is immortal. It lives on whenever prosecutors hide evidence, whenever police cut corners, whenever the system prioritizes closing cases over finding truth. It lives on whenever we forget that behind every case number is a human being, behind every conviction is a family, behind every sentence is a life that will be either justly interrupted or unjustly destroyed. The FBI headquarters in Boston has a different feel now than it did in the 1960s. The cowboys like Rico and Kindon are gone, replaced by agents who, hopefully, learned from their predecessors' crimes. But in the shadows of that building, in the memories of those who lived through this scandal, there's a knowledge that can't be erased. The system failed catastrophically, and innocent people paid the price. Before we continue, a quick clarification. This video is for educational and documentary purposes only. This content does not promote, glorify, justify, or encourage violence, criminal behavior, gangs, or illegal activity of any kind. The intent is to educate viewers about real-world crimes, their consequences, and the social and psychological factors behind them. All events discussed are based on publicly available information and are presented to highlight their consequences. Viewer discretion is advised. As you finish reading this story, remember Edward Dagan, murdered in an alley in Chelsea, his death becoming a tool for even greater injustice. Remember Louis Greco and Henry Tamlio dying in prison while professing their innocence. Remember Ronald Casesso, guilty of many things but not this, dying behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Remember Joseph Salvati and Peter Limon, losing decades of their lives to lies and corruption. And yes, remember Joseph the animal Barboza too, not with sympathy, but as a warning. He was a monster created by circumstances, shaped by systems, and ultimately used by those who should have been better than him. His victims included not just the 26 people he murdered, but the 4 innocent men he sent to death row, their families, their children, their grandchildren who carry the trauma still. The mob called him the animal, and the name was accurate. But what does it say about us, about our society, about our justice system, that we created him, used him, protected him, and then let him destroy innocent lives in our name? What does it say that it took 30 years for the truth to come out, and even then, only because of the tireless efforts of a few people who refused to give up? This is the real legacy of Joseph, the animal Barboza. A reminder that justice is not automatic, that systems can be corrupted, that innocent people can be destroyed by those sworn to protect them. It's a reminder that vigilance is the price of freedom, that questioning authority is not just a right but a responsibility, that sometimes the greatest criminals are those who hide behind badges and titles and the presumption of righteousness. The animal is dead, he has been for decades now, but the cage that created him, poverty, abandonment, violence, corruption, that cage still exists. And somewhere perhaps another animal is being created, another weapon being forged, another tragedy being set in motion. The question is not whether it will happen again, but whether we'll recognize it in time to stop it. This time, maybe, we'll remember the lessons written in the blood of Edward Deegan, in the wasted years of Salvati and Limon, in the prison deaths of Greco and Tamlio. Maybe we'll remember that when we allow our institutions to operate without oversight, when we prioritize results over righteousness, when we forget that every defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty, we create the conditions for animals to thrive. Or maybe we won't. Maybe the next animal is already out there, already killing, already being protected by those who should know better. Maybe innocent people are sitting in prison cells right now, convicted on the testimony of liars and the complicity of those sworn to uphold justice. Maybe the only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. But for Marie Salvati, who waited 30 years for her husband to come home, for the Limon children who grew up without their father, for the families of Greco and Tamlio who buried innocent men branded as killers, the lessons are carved into their souls. They know what the rest of us should never forget, that justice delayed is justice denied, that power without accountability is tyranny, and that sometimes the real animals are the ones we trust to protect us from animals. The story ends where it began, with a body on a San Francisco street, blood pooling beneath a car, a violent man meeting a violent end. But Joseph Barboza's death didn't end the suffering he caused. It didn't bring back the years stolen from innocent men. It didn't heal the families destroyed by his lies. It didn't restore faith in a system shown to be corrupt to its core. What it did was close one chapter in a story that continues to this day, a story about the price of injustice, the cost of corruption, and the terrible truth that sometimes the monsters we fear aren't hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they're standing in courtrooms, wearing badges, carrying the authority of the state, and destroying innocent lives with the same casual cruelty that Joseph, the animal Barboza, brought to everything he touched. The animal is dead. But the system that created him, used him, and protected him. That system lives on, reformed perhaps, chastened maybe, but still capable of creating new animals, new victims, new tragedies. And that, more than anything Joseph Barboza ever did, should keep us awake at night. Because in the end, the most terrifying thing about Joseph, the animal Barboza, isn't what he was, it's what he represents. The complete failure of every system designed to prevent people like him from existing, and worse, the willingness of those systems to use people like him regardless of the cost in innocent blood. That's why the mob called him the animal, not just because he was violent, not just because he was ruthless, but because he represented something primitive and wrong at the heart of how we sometimes pursue justice. He was their animal, then he was the FBI's animal, and in the end, he was no one's animal, just a man who died as violently as he lived, leaving behind a trail of destruction that took decades to even partially clean up. The documentary ends here, but the questions it raises remain. How many more animals are out there? How many more innocent people are behind bars? How many more lies are being protected by those sworn to uphold the truth? And perhaps most importantly, what are we going to do about it? Because if the story of Joseph, the animal Barboza, teaches us anything, it's that monsters aren't born, they're made. And sometimes the people making them are the very ones we trust to protect us from monsters. That's the real horror, that's the lasting legacy. That's why, decades after his death, the name, the animal, still sends chills down the spines of those who understand what it really means.